part of the process. We have to meet with the audit committee, talk about the audit process, and do that now, and we'll also come back at the end of the audit and meet with the audit committee, review draft financial statements. Okay. So what I put together is just a quick outline that just talks a little bit about some of the key items with regards to what we're going to talk about today. So we'll talk a little bit about the scope of services, management's responsibility, audit approach. I won't spend a lot of time on each slide. Each slide just really is for a global overview. A lot of information is fairly consistent from one year to the next, especially that information that's required. So the scope of services is our audit is the audit of the basic financial statements, which are the general fund, your operating funds. Okay, so your general fund, your school lunch operations, your federal programs, your capital projects. We also have to audit the federal compliance audit, so it's what's called a single audit. So the school district receives funds from the federal government, and along with those funds, the federal government says that you have additional work that the auditors need to do to look at your compliance. So it's more process and procedural related. Just an example would be for your let's just say your handicap service students or your handicapped kids. We have to identify kids being serviced, and then we have to look at their files to make sure that the district has complied with certain requirements relating to parental communication, notification from doctors, and so forth. Okay, so that's kind of what we look at when we look at the compliance audit. And then there's this audit of the student activity funds. So as you know, those are the accounts where the students have all of their clubs and they're on good fundraising and so forth. And so that's really the other audit that we do related to student activity funds. That audit we do qualified, as you know, with kids and cash and faculty advisors. Can be challenging to have the best internal controls and checks and balances. So we qualify our opinion until those monies get turned into the central treasurer for deposit. And that's really standard in the industry. Okay, so all of our clients get qualified opinions. Most auditors that audit school districts provide qualified opinions to school student activity funds. Okay, so those are the types of audits, the different types of audits we're doing. Again, I've walked through those particular audits. As far as what we do, we have certain roles and responsibilities, but there's also roles and responsibilities of management, basically making all the information available to us, having internal controls, checks and balances. They're really your internal controls and checks and balances. Following up on any corrective action. So there's certain functions that management have to do in order for us to complete that audit. So that's just some of the items that are listed there. Again, all part of a standard audit process. All audits are risk-based approach, okay? So we don't audit every single transaction. It really is based on risk. And really the thought concept is the more risk, the more audit we'll do in an area. So when we go into an audit, it really becomes a risk-based approach. And really where we start is what's changed in the district from last year to this year. Has there been change in key personnel, right? Have you implemented new processes and procedures, or are there new computer systems that you're using? All of those would tend to increase a higher risk. So we have to look at our audit process and say, have we designed our audit to address those higher risk areas? And if we don't, we have to redo the audit, or we have to address it, or we redo our procedures or design procedures to address those additional areas. Okay, so it's a risk-based approach. So it's not, no audit looks at every single transaction. Okay, so that's just really the key point there. And really, it's the higher the risk, the more procedures we're going to do in any given area. Okay, and it's on your key controls. Okay, so key controls are things like your entity level control, your tone at the top. What are your conflict of interest, your policy and procedures in place relating to that? So the tone at the top, and how is that disseminated throughout the rest of the agency, okay, or the school district? Information technology, information communication. How are your internal controls, checks and balances communicated to your employees? Okay, how are you monitoring your internal controls and checks and balances? What are you doing with that? What kind of operational controls and checks and balances do you have? So those are all part of that process. We have to understand those controls, we have to write them down, and we have to test them. Okay, again, all part of a standard audit process. Again, mainly focusing on key controls as we go through that process.
Tom, just looking at the pamphlet you have skimmed a couple pages before you got to the key controls. Scope of service,
What?
management responsibilities, and audit. Is there, and then it went to key controls.
Yeah, I'm not sure how it was photocopied.
What's that?
It's all on the slides that are on the.
They're numbered.
Yeah, they are numbered.
Yes.
I read. Where's that? All right.
I think he might.
What's that?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, yeah, so again, I'm not spending a lot of time on each slide. There's a lot of slides there. However, if you have a question or each individual bullet point, feel free to let me know. And I can spend a little more time on it. So, again, I'm on slide 7, just again talking a little bit about the significant audit areas. We just talked a little bit about the risk assessment process, the key controls that we look at. But these are just the typical significant audit areas that you would look at in most audits. Obviously, cash, your procurement, your payables, your revenues, receivables. So your key financial cycles become some of the key areas that we spend some time on. The next slide, compliance. Again, I talked a little bit about the federal compliance requirements. So again, the different compliance requirements, there's laws and regulations that the school district has to comply with. A good example would be like your procurement policies and procedures that you have in place. The state says there's General Municipal Law 103, 104B relating to bidding compliance. So if you have over $20,000 for purchase items or $35,000 for public works contracts, you have to go out and you have to publicly bid, or you have to piggyback off of like a state contract or another municipal contract. Okay, so there's certain compliance requirements that we'll look at as we go through part of the audit. And again, with any audit, we also have to talk about the risk of fraud. Okay, 15 years ago, that really wasn't part of an audit. Okay, the risk of fraud, we really didn't even want to talk about fraud, but for the past many years, that's really become part of that audit. We have to really understand, how is fraud implemented? What could happen in a school district? Okay, so we talk a little bit about that. And with any fraud, there's certain characteristics. So, there's the characteristics of your ability to rationalize things. There could be some opportunity. There's always incentive and pressure. So what they've done is the industry has looked at this, and any major fraud, these characteristics have always been present, right? So as we go through the audit process, we do talk with folks, both inside management and outside management. We have a conversation with them. Do you have any concerns? Is there anything unusual that you see? And again, if anything comes to our attention, we have to look at our processes and procedures. So we have to make sure that if something comes to our attention, we look at it, we scrutinize it, and we evaluate it, and make sure our audit procedures really address any concerns there. Okay, and of course, if something comes up, we'll certainly have a conversation with the appropriate level of management and or board or audit committee. And again, it's kind of interesting with those characteristics. Really, the school district can only control one of those 3 characteristics. Okay, and it's the characteristic of opportunity, right? How do you control opportunity? It's the types of checks and balances that you have in place. Okay, so that's your internal controls, your checks and balances. So you want to eliminate your opportunity as much as you can as a school district with the developing, the design of your checks and balances. Okay. So again, fraud, we have to address it as part of the audit process now, we'll certainly continue to look at and evaluate that. Again, in addition to the fraud that we have to look at, we do brainstorming, interviewing. So we have a very nice process that we do as part of that. But management also has to have some type of fraud detection or preventative process in place. Okay, and that process, a good example is your whistleblower policy. Okay, that's a policy that the district has developed, and that's really a fraud preventive or detective nature that the district has put in place. Okay, so that's again a role of management, role of the board. In addition to that, one of the other slides, slide 11, we talk a little bit about the technical area. Again, this is an area that the state controller continues to look at, fund balance and reserves, and this is just where the district was at the end of last year, okay, and about $17 million in total fund balance at the end of the year. You know, the district total fund balance increased about $4.5 million, you know, and we continue to look at that. You know, the district appropriated $1 million in fund balance to support your budget for this current year, okay? So that's something that we continue to monitor. $1 million seems relatively reasonable for a district this size in terms of appropriated fund balance, okay? But it is an area that we continue to talk about with the reserves. You want to make sure that you have a good reserve plan in place, that there's a lot of good discussions around the reserves as they relate to the funding levels, okay? Having the board involved in the discussion, understanding how those reserves impact your budget process. In addition to appropriating fund balance, the district is also appropriating several reserves to support the budget. So for the current year we're auditing, the 17-18 fiscal year, the board had appropriated $4.3 million in reserves and fund balance, okay, to support the operations, all right? So, you know, again, that's all based on your budgets. So you're going into the year saying that you are planning on eroding fund balance $4.3 million, all right? Actually, it's 4.4 when you add the other 100,000. So you're going into your budget for this current year, you're planning on using fund balance. But what happens? Well, sometimes you don't spend all of the budget, and sometimes you get more revenue than you had anticipated, right? So all of a sudden you generate some surplus, okay? And that's where you see some differences. So you plan on eroding fund balance, you may gain some fund balance. You may end the year and you may have more fund balance than you thought you were going to erode, and you would allocate those generally into reserves or appropriate that into fund balance. Again, that's because you're building a budget based on estimates. Really, for June 30th, 18, you started that budget process probably about a year and a half ago, right? So trying to anticipate what are the utilities going to do, what are certain other costs going to do. So that's where you do see some surplus generated. So health insurance, that's probably one of the biggest challenges for school districts that are self-funded, and of course that's what this district is self-funded. So, so again, you know, monitoring that number is very, very important, because as you appropriate fund balance and reserves, just to break even, you've got to generate $4.4 million on your budget surplus this year. Okay, that's just to break even. All right. So reserves and fund balance, again, just to continue to communicate that, to monitor that, you know, having a good long-range financial plan really are key aspects of monitoring the reserves and fund balance. In fact, the governor, state controller has felt that it's so important. There are several new laws that are out there, that relate to the reserves and fund balance. In fact, the property tax report card that was brand new this year, where the district had to report a lot more information about your reserves and fund balance on that property tax report card. Okay, not only did you have to report each specific reserve, but the purpose, the dollar amount as of March, and what you intend to use it for next year. So there's a lot more information, and really moving, again, more towards transparency. So in addition to the property tax report card, the new law requires any reserve you have to fund with the board resolution, okay? I don't necessarily think that's really been a big challenge for most of our clients, but I think there are some clients down in the Long Island area that may not have done that. So therefore, the state felt they needed to put it into law to actually have a resolution to support the funding of each of the different reserves on an annual basis. In addition to that, new website requirements. Okay, so again, effective for this year was recording or posting the different audit reports you have to your website. Again, for really in the eyes of more transparency, putting this information out there for the community. So again, the audit, management letter, any corrective action plan, any state audit, obviously your budget needs to be reported. So again, all brand new legislation that's out there that school districts have to continue to report on. Again, continuing to move in that transparency section. Some of the other changes this year, there was a new fiscal stress calculation Won't spend a lot of time on that. The state just changed the way they did their calculation. You know, it's a calculation. They do a good job with it. However, it really isn't forward-looking. It really is looking more back at historical information. So it's a calculation. You're probably going to know you're in fiscal stress way before the state tells you that through your budget process. But it is out there, and they will tell you if you're in fiscal stress, and the district isn't currently in fiscal stress. School lunch shaming, that is another new requirement that school districts have to continue to monitor. In fact, last year there was a federal requirement, and as part of the state budget, the state required some additional communications that school districts had to do for this coming year. So you have to have a plan, it has to be submitted to the commissioner, and it's also got to be posted to your website. So again, relating to school lunch shaming. All right. Some of the other key things that will impact your financial statements this year especially is what's called GASB 75, which is the reporting of a retiree health obligation. Okay, and the district's always had to report that obligation over the past couple of years. All right, so you've gone out and you've hired an actuarial, and they've come back and said that your total retiree health obligation is a little over $319 million. All right, and you have to amortize a portion of that on the books and records of the school district. And this really is just for the full accrual, so the corporate style financial statements. So it's included in your financial statements, not part of how you audit, or I'm sorry, not part of how you operate, because you operate on a pay-as-you-go basis. So if your retiree costs are $1 million, you budget $1 million and you pay $1 million, all right? This just calculates what is that liability if you were to close business today. And that liability is about $319 million, all right? What's going to happen is you've been amortizing that, so you've only recognized about $154 million on your corporate style financial statements. So when I look at your financial statement for 2017, you had an $86 million deficit net position. Now that's only recognizing a portion of that obligation. What this new standard requires is you to put that whole amount on your financial statement. So what's it mean? Well, you're going to have, instead of having an $86 million deficit, it's going to be a lot higher. Okay. And again, the bond rating agencies, they really said it's not going to impact your bond rating. But I think what they've begun to acknowledge is that New York State municipalities, more specifically public school districts, have one challenge that most other municipalities don't. Even some municipalities in other states, is you have this property tax cap. Okay. So what those bond rating agencies are beginning to acknowledge is that you can't just go out and levy a tax to pay for these expenses anymore, because you have to stay within a property tax cap. Now, will that impact the district in the next 3 to 5 years? Probably not. But will people begin to start paying more attention to this and identifying this? This is a pretty significant item, because when you look at a financial statement, and if I put another $150 million on your financial statements, you're going to have a negative $250 million net position. Okay? Someone's going to start asking questions about that. And I think what's going to happen is I think some folks are going to begin to start paying attention to that. They're going to compare districts of similar size, similar types, and I think there will be some conversation. So what's important to understand is that this liability, it's something that's based on the contracts you have in place, okay? And it's something that the state doesn't allow you to fund, and that's why you see that big negative numbers. You can't set dollars aside, okay? Unlike the pensions, where the state says you owe us this much money, you pay it, and the state pension systems are nearly funded. In fact, the teacher retirement system is overfunded, and the employee retirement system is like at 94 to 95%, somewhere in there. So this is similar to a pension system, but it's not funded. Okay. Again, I think you will see some folks begin to compare districts to districts and start asking more questions, especially districts with similar budget size. So that's probably the most significant impact. There are a couple other minor items related to the single audit, the federal requirements. Again, the district's been working on those. Crowdfunding, we only include that there is because we are getting more and more questions relating to crowdfunding. If districts are doing it, we're telling them you may want to pause it, because SED really hasn't provided any guidance on it, whether school districts can really do it or not. So you just want to be careful of it. If you do have some going on, you just really want to make sure you're understanding what's going on, what's the board's understanding, do you have policies and procedures in place. You know, what we really advise our clients to do is to pause it until we get some guidance from SED. Okay, but we are seeing that out there. You know, the last bullet point is we will review and follow up on any of the prior year management letter items, and as part of the audit process, we'll communicate that to the board the status of those items. Okay, that really is a quick summary of what the audit process is, what we'll be doing over the next couple of weeks. We're coming back in I think 2 weeks to really finish the audit. I think the timeline would be once we complete the audit, the financial statements get prepared, management reviews them. They have to prepare what's called a management discussion and analysis, and then we'll come back and we'll meet with the audit committee and review the draft financial statements, probably sometime in either late September or early October time. Okay, I think that would be really the time frame that we be following, consistent with what we follow. Okay? Do you have any questions?
Invite them back to, you meet with the audit committee again at the end of the process.
Yes.
In the prior years, last few years, I've invited you back to present a summary of what you report to the audit committee,
Yep.
the entire board.
Typically, we would spend a lot more time with the audit committee than we would with the entire board, so we can have a better conversation.
Right.